This is recall. You can use it on a single object to reverse the last 20 seconds or so of that object's path through space. In many ways, recall is this game's version of the stasis rune from Breath of the Wild. There's quite a lot in common between these two abilities. They both pertain to the passage of time, and they can both be used on a single object to make it do interesting things that the game's physics don't normally allow. And just as we used stasis to launch Link in Breath of the Wild, we can use recall to launch him in Tears of the Kingdom. This video is about the recall launch. I have been working with this technique since the day that the game came out. And since then, through discoveries made both by myself and a couple other people, we have gone from this to this. I wanted to recount that brief history, as well as the events that led me to recently performing the biggest recall launch ever recorded in Tears of the Kingdom. Without further ado, let's dive right in. I hope you will enjoy this as much as I do. Our story begins on May 12, 2023, 13 hours after the game's release. I was messing around with recall on the Great Sky Island and noticed that not only does it rewind an object's position in space, but also its orientation. What's more, this remains true even after you've attached something to the object using Ultra Hand. By combining these two concepts, I performed my first recall launch, and perhaps one of the first ever recorded. The launch itself was pretty basic. I spun a piece of zonite using an arrow, and then I attached a baseball bat made out of logs to the end of it. When I recalled the zonite, it undid the spin caused by the arrow, but it did so with the logs attached, and they swung around and hit Link and launched him a few meters off the Great Sky Island. Now, I know what you're thinking. This launch isn't really all that impressive, especially considering what we can do now. But it's not really the launch itself that matters, but rather what we learned from it. I have learned that for any recall launch, there are 3 laws that you have to keep in mind when trying to perform a launch. The first law is as follows. For any recall launch, you will need to rotate an object in a stable manner around one axis. The reason for this is pretty simple. If you give your recall target a kind of dirty, unstable rotation, and then you try to attach something using Ultra Hand, if you recall the recall target, the attachment is probably going to break off before it can hit Link because it'll hit the ground or a wall or something. And so because of that, the recall launch is usually an exercise in learning how to perfectly spin an object about one axis. And as you will see going forward, the further you want to launch Link, the more perfect your spin needs to be. This is why I used a piece of zonite in that first video. Not only is the zonite light enough to be spun by a single arrow, but it's also kind of a cuboidal shape. That shape makes it more likely to rotate around one axis when shot, giving us a spin that we can use for a launch. And so putting all of this together, I performed my first recall launch. And if you pay attention, you can observe a second law of recall towards the end of this launch. The second law is as follows. Horizontal launches are disappointing. You see, Nintendo put all sorts of really aggressive speed caps on Link's horizontal speed. You can see this in the first launch. I was moving pretty fast, but the moment I pulled my glider, my speed was cut quite a bit. Nintendo probably implemented this speed cap because the paraglider was just too good at extending the range of things like stasis launches and wind bombs in Breath of the Wild. And what's more, this isn't just an effect of the paraglider. In basically any animation that I've seen so far, Link receives more friction along the X and Y axes than the Z axis. If you've ever felt that Link takes a kind of weird, unnatural path when launched by one of these bumpers on the Sky Islands, this is why. He has different air resistance horizontally than vertically. Because of that, any sufficiently powerful recall launch just kind of turns into a vertical launch at a certain point because all of your horizontal momentum dissipates. This is why, with the sole exception of my first launch, all my other launch showcases have been vertical. So, with all of that aside, there is just one more law to consider when trying to design a recall launch, and this one is probably pretty predictable. Basically, the faster your spin or the longer your attachment, the further you can launch Link. And so taking this third law in mind, I began looking for ways to cause faster spins and attach longer things so that we could get Link to go further. My first improvement to the recall launch came on May 19th, 2023, a week after the game came out. I found out that when you build a vehicle, AutoBuild does remember the orientation of parts composing it, and so if you have a bunch of components lying around and you pull AutoBuild, it will quickly snap those components to the proper orientation to build your vehicle. If you're clever about how you orient stuff, you can use this effect to produce a very stable rotation about a single axis, which lends itself well towards a recall launch. If you have an AutoBuild template that includes an inverted piece of Zonite ahead of time, then you can take out a piece of Zonite, invert it with AutoBuild, and attach a couple planks like this. From there, if you recall the Zonite and then jump right when it starts to move, you can launch Link vertically about 200 meters. The following day, I uploaded a video in which I chained 5 launches like this using hoverstones to launch Link from the ground level all the way up to the floating Lomé labyrinth. Now, at the time that felt pretty impressive, but the truth is each one of these launches demanded quite a bit of setup and didn't really get as far as I wanted to, so there was some room for improvement. And that improvement came on May 24th, 2023. That day, I was messing around with some fans and stuff, and I noticed that whenever you pick one up, it automatically snaps to an upright orientation in Link's hands, regardless of how it was when it was on the ground. This got me thinking, and after a little bit of experimentation, I eventually tried flipping the fan all the way over using Ultra Hand and then picking it up. If I slow down the animation of Link picking up this fan, you will notice a couple things. First off, the fan rotates in a stable manner about one axis, so it satisfies Law 1. Second, it rotates along a vertical trajectory, so it satisfies Law 2. And third, it rotates pretty quickly, so it satisfies Law 3. So I put down the fan, attached a plank, and hit it with recall. And with that, a new recall launch technique was born. I decided to call my new creation the OCO launch, where OCO stands for Oriented Carryable Object. Essentially, an OCO is any object that can be picked up by Link and takes on a certain orientation when he does so. Fans are a pretty good example of an OCO, but they are far from the only one. There are a whole lot of different OCOs in the game, and they oftentimes have different pickup animations from each other, so depending on which one you decide to use, you're going to get a unique flavor of OCO launch. Case in point, the Zonai battery has an extremely fast pickup animation. When it's inverted and you pick it up, it snaps into place so quickly you can't even really tell that it was rotating. And, as you would expect, we can harness this extremely rapid spin to perform quite a powerful launch. Using a battery OCO launch, I typically get somewhere around 400 meters, but I have gone north of 700. It was with this technique that I was finally able to perform a trick that I'd wanted to do since the start of the game, launching Link all the way back up a chasm. Seriously, don't sleep on the OCO launch. Although we have some more powerful techniques available to us, the OCO launch is really cheap and easy once you get used to it. If you need some more modest distances in the range of like 300 to 500 meters, this may be the one for you. But anyway, after discovering the OCO launch, I was pretty proud of myself. Up to that point, that was the biggest launch I'd ever performed, and I thought that maybe I'd discovered something that could finally be used in like a speedrun or something. But this pride was pretty short-lived. You see, a couple hours after I posted the OCO launch video, my brother showed me this. That video was a player named Deep40,000 performing the most powerful recall launch ever seen at the time, using nothing more than a plank and a spear. What's more, unbeknownst to myself, this video was posted on May 18th, 2023, only 6 days after the game came out. And as if that wasn't enough, a couple days later, Deep also posted this video of him using the same technique to launch all the way from the surface to the game's height limit at 3292 meters. To say that I was impressed by these videos would be a huge understatement. I mean, seriously, they're just awesome, and only a week out from the game's release. But as cool as they were, I couldn't help but feel a little bit disheartened. You see, all this time I'd been working thinking that I was helping with the recall launch, and I wasn't even really contributing anything at all because Deep had beaten me well before I'd even really gotten started. But putting my personal feelings on the matter aside, let's go ahead and take a closer look at Deep's technique, because it is nothing short of genius. What Deep had noticed is that when Link throws a spear, the spear rotates extremely quickly about its central axis. If we throw the spear and then quickly hit it with recall, we can use Ultra Hand to pluck it out of the air before it flies away. From there, if we attach the spear to a plank like this, we can recall it a second time and the spear will unspin with the plank attached and launch Link really far. Now, it is worth mentioning that I am far from the expert at this trick. It is pretty precise actually, so I don't really have much of a tutorial for you, and instead if you want to learn this for yourself, I recommend that you turn to this tutorial made by Blyze. But anyway, the Deep spear throw launch clocks in typically around 1 kilometer, but it can launch you to the game's height limit in rare circumstances. So yeah, from the surface level all the way up to the height limit. What could possibly beat that? Well, the answer to that question was nothing, for quite a long while at least. Over the next couple of days, I kind of gave up on my efforts to launch Link further and instead focused on some other topics which interested me. Most of my time during this period was spent researching the Zonai devices, and the results of that research became my combination calculator and the video about the battery. I was also running experiments on shrine parts to see how they would interact with stuff in the overworld. One day, on the afternoon of May 27th, 2023, I built this machine. This machine looks kind of strange, but it does have a purpose. I have the shock emitter there connected to a Gemimic motor, and on the rotor of the motor we have a plank. When turned on, the shock emitter powers the motor, and it makes the plank start spinning pretty fast, and my goal was to use this to experiment with the ascend animation. And sure enough, I did get some weird results. There was one time I got Link to kind of ascend into the air and then fail and fall back down. And I'm willing to bet that this was an intentional safeguard made by the devs to stop us from breaking ascend. But anyway, after a couple more minutes of testing, for whatever reason I don't really remember, I decided to bring the machine over to Lookout Landing. While I was moving the machine with Ultra Hand, I inadvertently pushed the left part of this bottom plank into this spiky wooden barricade. And to my great surprise, the machine did this. What you just witnessed was the until now unreleased footage of the birth of the Paracopter. And if you've been following this channel, then I'm sure you know what happens next. The day after, I did a little bit more research and boiled down the bare essentials necessary to make this effect happen. The machine consisted of 2 large parallel planks sandwiching the Gemimic motor. If you grab the lower plank with Ultra Hand and push the edge of it against something immobile, then the upper plank starts accelerating and can reach a speed of up to half a turn per frame. I decided to name this machine the Paracopter, both because it was composed of parallel planks and as somewhat of an homage to my online name. That same day, I adapted the machine for vertical movement and used it to launch Link 1500 meters. I was also able to use the machine to launch Link all the way from the depths to a sky island. And a couple days after that, in early June, I discovered that if you jump into the machine while it's already spinning, you can launch Link all the way up to the height limit. I took this technique that I used to hit the height limit and designed a new machine around it. You know it as the Paracopter version 2, which typically clocks in around 2,000 meters but pretty regularly hits the height limit. And it was around this time that I started asking myself a new question. Theoretically, just how far could you go with this thing? I mean, I know we can hit the height limit with it, but it's kind of cutting the launch short when that happens. I really want to know the true maximum distance that this thing can put out. Why do I want to know this so badly? Well, I'm a numbers guy, that's why. And so we've arrived at something of a problem. If I want to perform a true, untruncated, really strong paracopter launch, I've kind of run out of directions to go. You see, we can't really go sideways because of the second law of recall launches, and we can't really go up because we've run out of up. And so that leaves us with only one direction left to go. This is Death Mountain Chasm. As you probably know, Death Mountain Chasm is pretty deep. It spans from about 600 meters above zero to 1,000 meters below. If you fall at Link's normal speed, it takes nearly a full minute to get to the bottom. This is enough time to hear some rarely heard parts of the chasm diving music, which you are hearing now. The chasm itself is pretty wide, but as you can see, on the way down we need to dodge all of these massive flaming rocks to safely make it into the depths. Once we've managed to dodge all of the rocks, the chasm opens up into the core of Death Mountain. Most of the area down here is dominated by a huge lava field, but there are also a couple of other features which stand out. In the footage, I'm landing near the Moustis light route at about 950 meters below zero. However, the light route is not what we're here for. Instead, we're interested in this one random route poking out of the middle of the lava with this one big fungus on it. At this point, you can probably guess what I'm going to try to do here. To figure out once and for all just how powerful the paracopter is, we are going to thread the needle up Death Mountain Chasm and launch as high into the sky as we can possibly get. I chose this fungus above the lava as my starting point for two reasons. First, the fungus is located almost at the bottom of the chasm, which maximizes our usable vertical distance, but it's also high enough above the lava to give us room to spin up the paracopter. And second, in my experience, the best paracopter launches come with some level of horizontal momentum towards the start. The fungus is located in such a place that the horizontal momentum that we get tends to have a good chance of lining us up with the chasm. That being said, this is still far from easy. The starting location on the fungus just kind of makes it possible. Remember, we're not trying to just enter the chasm or even go all the way through Death Mountain. We're trying to fly through here with enough velocity to break records. And there are many factors standing in the way of that. First, as you saw earlier, the chasm is full of rocks. These are pretty good at getting in the way, and they killed an awful lot of attempts. If you even slightly brush one while going up, it will completely destroy your upward momentum. You have to dodge them entirely. More importantly, to even have a chance at breaking the record, we need a really strong paracopter launch, perhaps the strongest one that we've ever gotten. And of course, a strong launch means lots of speed, and with the more speed you have, the harder it'll be to dodge the rocks. For a bit of a reference, at the speed that we need to move, it will take exactly 4 seconds to go from our starting point in the depths all the way to the top exit of the Death Mountain Chasm. 4 seconds. If we could descend down the chasm that quickly, here's what that would look like. So yeah, I think I've made it pretty clear why this trick is so difficult. But we do what we must in the name of science. So, with nothing else more to do, I put on my glide suit, hit a fire potion, created a paracopter, and got to work. It took me 15 hours of attempting this over and over again until I got a really good launch that I was happy with. Here's what it looked like. That launch was pretty good, wasn't it? Let's play with some numbers real quick. We can find our launch distance using the minimap. Our starting z-coordinate was negative 1025, and we hit the apex of the launch at 3160. With some simple subtraction, we find that we just launched Link 4,185 meters. Not bad. With a little more work, we can also figure out Link's top speed. Stop right there. Link just got slammed by the paracopter and is currently moving extremely quickly. Let's make a note of our coordinates. Okay, I will advance the footage by a single frame right now. 1/30th of a second has passed. Let's make another note of our new coordinates. Taking the difference between those two positions, we find that Link moved 4 meters west, 5 meters north, and 17 meters up in the span of a single frame. Pythagorizing that vector to get its magnitude, we moved a total displacement of 18.2 meters. If we multiply that by the game's 30 frames per second, we find that Link was moving at 545 meters per second right after getting hit by the paracopter. That's equal to 1,962 kilometers per hour, and for my fellow Americans, 1,219 miles per hour. And finally, if we divide that by the speed of sound in air, 343 meters per second, we discover a horrifying truth. Link was moving at Mach 1.59. The game has been out for less than 2 months, and we have already broken the sound barrier. That's nothing short of absurd. I could make a whole video about the physical implications of this. Perhaps I will at some point. But as cool as that is, I couldn't help but be bothered by one thing. You see, we were really close to hitting the height limit on that one. Remember, the limit is 3292 meters. We were only off by 132. It was so close I could taste it. I wanted perfection, to be the first person to launch out of hell and touch the heavens, and so I got back to grinding. And I kept grinding. I kept at it for a while. Attempts started stacking up, but try as I might, I could never match that launch. So eventually, I just needed to let this one go. I cut my losses and began working on this video. But life has a funny way of playing out. Although we as humans like to imagine that the more effort you put into something, the more success you'll see from it, in reality, sometimes the only difference between success and failure is a single accident. On June 30th, 2023, I went back down Death Mountain Chasm for one final time to collect some B-roll footage for this video. The goal was to just record a couple of casual launches to show how hard the trick was. They weren't serious attempts. I didn't even have my glide suit on, and the minimap was turned off to make the footage look better. The plan was to only get about 10 minutes of footage as something of a demonstration, but 8 minutes into recording, this happened. "4,317 meters is currently the largest recall launch ever recorded in Tears of the Kingdom. Although our minimap was off, we know that we started at negative 1025 meters because we've done so many launches from here before. And of course we know by now that the height limit is 3292. But unfortunately, we will never know how fast that launch went. I just can't do the calculations without the minimap. I suppose I could try to replicate the launch with the minimap turned on, but honestly, I've had enough of attempting this. I'm tired, I want to work on other projects, so if someone else wants to get that data, you're welcome to do so, but you have a hell of a fight in front of you. So, for our figure for speed, I'm just going to use the Mach 1.59 from our last measured launch. I think that's impressive enough anyway. And with that, we have kind of concluded this part of the story of the recall launch. Make no mistake, this launch is not unbeatable. There are ways to surpass it, but that's a topic for another video and another time. As always, thank you so much for watching, and there are a couple of people who I wanted to extend my special thanks towards. The first on this list is the Nintendo Music guy, who did such a great job removing all of the sound effects from the trailer theme heard at the start of this video. Next, we have Deep 40,000, who created the spear throw launch technique and was probably the first person to break the sound barrier in Tears of the Kingdom. And finally, we have Blaze, who taught me how to do the spear throw launch with his tutorial video. I've linked all of them in the description below. And that's about it for now. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.